Welcome, Dr. Elizabeth DeWolfe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out today to hear a little bit about the great turnout of 1841. And it's a pleasure to talk about this as we conclude our official Women's History Month. But of course, studying the history of women is something that we should be doing every single month of the year. And so today we are going to talk about this phenomenal event, which is, we can be very proud, the very first labor strike in the state of Maine. And as you'll see, it was led by very young women. And so we'll think about some of the forces that pulled women into factory life and the cultural forces that pulled them out. And we'll also think about the legacy of those 500 young women who dared to raise their voices and they dared to raise a ruckus. So why should we care about this somewhat obscure moment in history? Because the legacy of these young women's ruckus is in our lives today. So in late March 1841, a rumor floated through the York Manufacturing Company. Samuel Batchelder, the company agent, was going to cut wages again. And in the boarding houses, in the evenings, the more experienced operatives met and discussed what could be done. They decided to strike. So on Monday morning, the carders and the spinners, the warpers and the weavers would walk out of the mills. So when Monday arrived, they gathered behind a marching band, they unfurled banners, and they marched through the streets of Biddeford and Saco. Nearly 500 young women, half the workforce of the York Manufacturing Company, turned out, as it was called, and marched through the streets proclaiming, "We scorn to be slaves." The procession ended at Saco's Free Will Baptist Meeting House. Men and women made speeches and officers were elected. Grievances were aired and a list of resolutions was drawn up and sent to Samuel Batchelder. As a later report put it, these young women, most no older than 20, no older than Chloe, had, quote, greatly disturbed the quietude of our usually peaceful villages. They had engaged in a turnout, a strike, the very first labor agitation in Maine. So why strike? What did these women hope to achieve? Mill work was the best paying occupation for young women in the antebellum era. In the roughly 25-year period from the 1830s to 1855, the majority of the labor force in New England textile mills was comprised of young white Protestant women aged roughly 14 to 24 who worked 6 days a week, earning, for the first time in American history, cash wages. The factories gave young women an opportunity to participate in the cash economy, to help support their families back home, and to fill their time and occupy their hands as factory-produced goods lessened the household tasks needing to be accomplished at home. And there are two lovely seats right up front. Thank you. Thanks for coming. So here we have young women, right? These are the daughters of New England farmers, daughters of New England merchants, and because of the Industrial Revolution and factory production, the types of activities their mothers and grandmothers did in the home, you know, weaving their own cloth, making their own candles, making their own soap, those tasks were no longer necessarily done in the home, especially in well-settled New England. It was cheaper to buy those goods than to do the labor to make them at home. But then you have all these young girls with idle hands. And as we all know, idle hands are the devil's workplace. So what should we do? Well, send them to the mills. So really, textile work was just an extension of the type of domestic labor young women had been performing for generations, although, of course, with much more powerful machinery. So this was a way to counter the superfluous hands of young women at home. So in this period between girlhood and marriage, factory work gave young women something productive to do. But what self-respecting father would allow his daughter to leave hearth and home for the city of Biddeford or Lowell or Dover? So to reassure worried parents, the textile mills enacted a series of innovations to deal with this predominantly young female workforce. These included strict regulations: no one younger than 14, no one who used liquor, smallpox vaccinations or proof of having had the disease were mandatory. Now, women lived in company-managed boarding houses where a house matron, often a widow, kept careful watch on her charges. Infractions of the rules were reported to the mill owners. There were curfews, there were rules about appropriate visitors, and there was a requirement to attend religious services. Room and board charges were automatically taken from the mill operative's pay, and in some mills, pew rent was taken out as well. The remaining wages were theirs to keep. But of course, technically, any wages earned by a woman by law belonged to her father if she were single, or her husband if she were married. Now, the regulations were designed to protect the reputations of young women and therefore assure parents it was okay to send them to the mills. Now, of course, this is in the manufacturer's best interest. They needed a workforce, and a workforce that is going to show up, not drunk, at 5 a.m. and get to work. So curfews and a tight regulation on private time helps. So in Saco, Biddeford, mill girls lived on Factory Island, as we well know, conveniently located between the two villages. So the rise of the textile mills right here provided not only occupation for women and for young men, but numerous satellite businesses, boarding houses, stables, blacksmiths, stores, carriages. In the 1840s, Saco and Biddeford boomed. One enterprising young man wrote home to his friends, and he said, "There is not a room to rent or a business to be let." Biddeford became the richest place per capita in Maine, and by some accounts, in the United States. Biddeford, Maine, the richest place per capita in 1849. The wealth trickled down to other communities too. Farmers sold crops to feed the mill force, and those who grew potatoes sold them to starch mills, which processed the potatoes into starch, which was used for sizing calico and other cotton fabrics. The textile factories also used a tremendous amount of coal, whale oil, tallow, and other lighting and heating products. And this economic success fell squarely on the shoulders of the girls at the York Manufacturing Company. Women were 80% of the workforce. Textile work was highly regulated. Here's the table of the Lowell mills, but it was similar at every textile factory across New England. So there were a system of bells to ring workers into the factory and out again. If you were late, you did not work and you did not get paid. As I'm sure we're all well familiar, one of the most visible sights in this town is the clock tower. And that's so you could always know what time it was and where you were supposed to be. But that clock tower represents a key shift in how Americans thought about the day. Previous to the Industrial Revolution, one worked according to task. You milked when the cow's udders were full, you made cider when the apples were ripe, you seeded the soil when spring allowed. But the Industrial Revolution and factory work is organized around time, and time, as we know today, is money. This is all about maximizing the efficiency of your labor force to produce products. Now, trains play a key role in this as well. The first train travel arrives in Saco in 1842, and when trains are moving back and forth, it's a really good idea to send them to their destination, not when they just happen to be full of passengers, but rather when other trains won't be on the same track. So schedules come to organize and order many people's lives. With our day planners and our countdown apps on our phones, we know all too well the outcome of the move to making efficient use of time. So for money, for freedom, to make productive use of time, or for an adventure, young women flocked to the mills. The manufacturing process was vertically integrated. In other words, in the factory building, all the steps of cloth making occurred, from sorting and cleaning the raw cotton, to turning cotton into yarn, to setting up looms, to weaving the fabric, and then finishing the fabric. And workers made good money. So in 1841, at the York Manufacturing Company, after room and board was removed, the carders, who cleaned the wool, cleared about $1.48 a week, spinners $1.67, weavers about $2, warpers a little bit more, and dressers, who finished the fabric, anywhere from $2.40 to $2.74. Beyond what was already taken out for room and board. That is a very strong salary. And in fact, the wages compared favorably, if not better, to other female occupations such as teaching, domestic service, or sewing. Room and board in the mid-1830s to 1840s was about $1.25 a week. So girls were pocketing $1.50 to $2 of cash per week. Now, this work was dangerous. It was noisy. The air was filled with fabric dust, which could lead to respiratory problems. And that dust was highly flammable, and fires did turn workrooms into infernos. Dresses, limbs, or long hair could get caught in the machinery with gruesome results. Operatives worked up to 14 hours a day, and mill owners pushed their limits. You would start by handling one loom, and then two, and then four, and then 8. This labor was vastly different from the spinning or weaving these women's grandmothers would have done in their now old-fashioned homes. Now, the agents did provide free medical care to its employees. They would send physicians to boarding houses when someone fell ill. And again, their system is paternalistic, caring for the physical and moral health of their employees. In Saco, there were writing lessons and a lending library. In Lowell, the mill sponsored a factory operative literary journal, the Lowell Offering, where young women could try their hand at writing essays, short stories, poems, or even op-eds. They could even serve as the editor. The mill agents used this publication as proof that this work was not harmful to young women, but in fact it could be educational and thus better fit them for their future role as mothers raising the next generation of American leaders. And despite the long days, young women enjoyed all that these factory towns had to offer. In Saco, The place to be seen after work was Pepperell Square, where the goal was to see and be seen. Girls had their photograph taken, or they went shopping for knickknacks, candy, hair ribbons, and other fripperies, as the critics called their purchases. There were lectures and performances to attend, or they could stay in their boarding house parlor, perhaps writing letters, sewing, or entertaining an appropriate guest. But a key point here is that these young women could decide for themselves what to do. They discovered what today we call agency. So in 1841, Saco and Biddeford are starting to boom. And here's a wonderful bird's eye view. This is from 1855. Biddeford is right there in the center. You can see the red brick mill buildings and the steam rising to show how productive they are. If you look way out on the horizon, you see all those little black hash marks. Those are the sails of ships that are taking the products. And one of the biggest customers was actually, ironically, China. So we were getting very wealthy sending goods to China and many places as well. And you can see this is a very kind of celebratory. Bird's eye views at this time were very, very popular. It was a way to show people your town or your city was great. And so mills smack in the middle. And we see the train coming in here, so showing we're connected to the rest of the world. And see these little people here. They are all standing here. We're all gazing upon the wonder that is Saco and Biddeford, and see how the land is torn up because we're building, building, building. And really the only agriculture we see is tucked down here, because what's important now are those mills right smack in the center. This is a moment of boom in Saco and Biddeford. Young women have found lucrative employment and a different path away from domesticity. The factories made lots of people very prosperous. And then the mill girls walked out. There's precedent for the turnout. In Dover, New Hampshire in 1828, 300 to 400 mill girls went on strike and marched in a procession of women firing off gunpowder. In 1834, a second strike saw 800 women marching in protest against restrictive regulations. In Lowell, in 1834, women protested wage reductions. In 1836, women struck against a rise in the cost of board. So the Maine mill girls were part and parcel of this trend, and no doubt got their idea and language from participation in or knowledge of these other protests. So, come right in. Protests took a very familiar form. There was marching in public, there was music or gunpowder, there were songs and chants and patriotic language, such as describing themselves as daughters of freemen or having patriotic ancestors. The verb enslave was frequent as well. So the Biddeford protest followed this cultural script. So the Biddeford strikers marched through the streets of Biddeford and Saco and ended up at the meeting hall on Temple Street. Their demands included boarding. Operatives resisted being forced to live in company housing. Complaints included the rising price for board, but also cramped quarters, lack of ventilation, and the danger of illness. And so you can see this is March 23rd, 1841, so we're right around the time of the strike, and here's a notice from Samuel Batchelder saying every person in the employment of the York Company will be expected to board in one of the regular boarding houses, and those who do not comply with this regulation will be discharged. You'll be fired. Wages, wage reduction. The operatives pointed to a wage reduction of April 1840 that had come with an implied promise to restore wages once conditions had improved. But that hadn't happened, and now there was another cut looming. There were 2 or 3 days of what was termed fruitless negotiations. Batchelder finally made a demand of his own. Come back to work tomorrow or don't come back at all. And most didn't. Some went home, some went to other jobs in Maine, or some went to Lowell, which was desperate for workers. So here you can see a broadside from April 5th, and this is really kind of sticking it to the mill owner, saying, yeah, see, an overseer at one of the Lowell factories states 500 girls are wanted, 40 weavers, immediate employ. So you can imagine, as word of this turnout is circulating through New England, Lowell down the road is saying, 500 already experienced textile operatives just walked out of the mill? Okay, we'll make them an offer. And so here's another sort of poster advertising looking for women to work. So Batchelder must know that people are trying to, be predatory on his workforce. But Batchelder did lay down that law. Come back or lose your job. The turnout failed. Dorcas Harmon Nutter, who participated in the strike, many years later reminisced. She said, "A few went back, but the majority of the young women proved loyal and went elsewhere for work." Describing this momentous event, she said, "We had a just grievance. We didn't win. The corporation was too strong." And she was right. They did have a just grievance, and the corporation was very strong. Concerned about the upset the mill girls had caused, a town committee was formed to investigate their concerns. The committee was comprised entirely of men, none of whom had ever sewed a stitch or run a loom. They investigated the cause of the turnout and blamed 2 disgruntled older women, meaning they were in their 20s, who had, they concluded, cajoled inexperienced girls and plotted to bring the maximum number of workers out of the mill. Instead of walking out at a designated time, which was the initial plan, the strike organizers talked up the turnout during breakfast, realizing it would be easier for women to simply not enter the mill than walk away once they were already inside. And it was a very effective strategy to maximize the participation in the turnout. The committee dismissed the wage reduction of 5 cents a day as inconsequential, and as for diseases, pointed out that the mill provided a company-hired doctor who assured the committee that there was a lack of epidemic disease. The committee found for the mills. Clearly, the so-called leading men of the committee and other business leaders were worried about investors catching wind of unrest in the mills. Let the factory handle its own affairs, they concluded. It's in everyone's best interest. Well, perhaps everyone, but the female employees. In addition to keeping investors happy, mill agents needed to assure the parents of mill girls that factory towns were safe places for their daughters. What kind of a community was this where young women, girls, are rallied to march publicly in the streets? Being out of parental surveillance could be even more dangerous than parading up Main Street. And there are numerous dramatic stories of girls who went down an unfortunate path. And in Biddeford and Saco, it was a young woman who was known as Mary Bean, who was seduced, left pregnant, and died at the hands of a doctor. Her death tore open the dark side of factory life. If, as a newspaper editor opined, these were modern times of progress for Biddeford and Saco, was the price for progress the death of young women, the future mothers of our next generation? Bean's story, in fact, was not only discussed in the newspaper, but transitioned into fiction as well. So this story fictionalized facts. It made a dramatic interpretation that took the gray of real life and made it black and white. A city populated by evil seducers and innocent, naive girls. Dozens of such stories abounded in the 1840s and 1850s. And in the course of my research for the murder of Mary Bean, I think I found 10 stories. The beautiful Saco girl, the beautiful Biddeford girl, the Saco factory girl. And so it's the same setting of girls who come to the mills here, and they go down a bad path, and they either end up dead, insane, or pregnant, and then dead. And only one girl, I think she's the beautiful Saco factory girl. The beautiful Saco factory girl cares for her grandmother and manages to find an apartment so when she's at the mill, she can see grandma across the street. And this young woman is so dutiful. She never buys a hair ribbon. She only buys religious publications. Everyone knows she's beautiful, but not her. Oh, no, she's not vain. And one night, there's a terrible fire. Help, help. And a young man on a horse happens to come by, and he rushes in and he saves the beautiful factory girl and brings her outside. And he rushes back to get grandma, but alas, too late. Grandma is dead. And when the girl comes to consciousness, she realizes that her savior is the son of the mill owner, and he has secretly loved her from afar. And so her virtue might have killed her grandmother, but her virtue gives her ultimate success. The fascinating thing about these and there were factory stories that were set in Lowell and Lawrence as well. The fascinating thing is when this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant workforce leaves the mills by about 1855 and is replaced largely by immigrant populations, these cautionary tales for mill girls just fall right off the radar. White New England society really isn't all that interested in what happens to immigrant daughters. What happens, though, is these cautionary tales follow where girls go. The murdered maiden student, higher education, and then all sorts of shop girls. Mariah Cornell is another factory girl. Cigar girl, New York City, worked in a cigar and cigarette shop. And then Pearl Bryant worked in a shoe shop outside of Cincinnati. Cigar Girl is the story of Marie Roger. Pearl Bryant is sadly, headless, is a very true story, as is Sarah Cornell. So the cautionary tales just basically follow the New England daughters to whatever new venture is taking them away from home. And the moral of all of these stories is the same. Girls, stay home. And in New England in the 1840s, there's a little bit of a cultural backlash against the mill girls, those who agitated for better conditions and those who stepped off the path of the straight and narrow. This poem, really interesting, highlights a pro-mill perspective. And in this poem, which is really dreadful, and we're not surprised this is not in any anthology of the great works of American poetry, but what it does is it recasts the work experience as healthy, moral, and preparatory for young women's true roles. So what we see up here is, and this only exists as a photocopy of the original. The original, sadly, has vanished from the museum collection, which was housed. So all we have is this rather crummy photocopy. But this is written in Biddeford around 1852. The trial for the murder of Mary Bead was in the spring of 1851. And a lot of those sensational fiction pieces are being published in 50, 51, and 52. So here are the mill owners going, you know, ruh-roh, we got all these murder tales circulating, let's push back. So they start out by describing how pleasant the girls are with their spirits light and free, and the girl is beautiful, and she is fair and bright and soft and white. And my dawn's early light to the dark of the night. She's kind and dutiful. And so we get this kind of duty here. And a really interesting line is, sages all confess, exercise will bless. Exercise, 14 hours in front of a power loom, good exercise. Exercise will bless. Ladies, more or less. And so here they're alluding to, they're not girls, they're not young women of marriageable status yet. They're this betwixt and between. They're ladies, more or less. And that idleness always will distress the fair most fearfully. So here we're addressing that idea. If they're home, they're going to have idle hands. So let's put them to meaningful work. About the pay, some say it's scanty. C. Austin here, and we don't know who C. Austin is. C. Austin fights back and says, little every day earned and laid away soon amounts to a considerable. Work, as if by stealth, paves the way to wealth and to rosy health and a well-filled table. And that well-filled table means the table of her future home, her future husband and children. So she is earning money not to buy any sort of frivolous dress or hair ribbon, but rather to save it for her future family. Buying useful books to improve her mind. Making, let's see, taking much more care with rich trimmings rare. You don't need any of that. To deck and prepare mind than body bare. Mind, which is an heir to a mansion. Where's that mansion? That mansion. Great mansion in the sky. So here they're saying, you know, they are articulating the standard virtues of what some scholars have called true womanhood. You're domestic, you are pious, you are pure, and you are submissive. And that is how Austin is depicting the workforce. Oh, and then here is why this didn't win a Pulitzer, I do not know. Such a brilliant brightness, such a lovely lightness, such a snowy whiteness, such a firm uprightness, such a frugal tightness, such a nimble sprightliness, such a kind politeness, oh, how delectable. Such a flying fleetness, such a needful neatness, such a true discreetness, such a charming sweetness, such a rare completeness, oh, how respectable. So again, that idea, you don't want your daughter to lose her respectability. That is the greatest virtue that a young woman would have. And by respectability, we mean you're not drinking and you're certainly still a virgin and still appropriate to be married. Then we get to the big point. We get to the big point. So why go to the mills? Well, here's the dream that's being held out. Many a lovely girl, destined to unfurl, charming beauties curl, where the waters hurl and the spindles twirl, may see fortune whirl with great agility, making her a wife, free from want and strife, living a happy life with rich blessings rife in great gentility. Respectability, gentility, free from want and strife, these are all code words for the middle class, which means by definition your wife did not work outside of the home. So here's the goal. Mill work for this generation of young women was understood and was, for the most part, temporary, filling those years before marriage. But this is what you should be aiming for. So what we end up with is a mixed perception of factory girls, either doing something useful and temporary in preparation for marriage, or wasting their time and money on useless and dangerous pursuits. And this is captured in an 1841 description of Saco factory girls penned by this woman, Cecilia Siddons Combe, who visited Maine with her husband, who was a well-known phrenologist, reading the bumps on the head. And she would go along with him, and she was curious to learn about factory life and what it was like in New England. And she notes the trickle-down effect of so many factory girls opting for factory work over domestic service. And at first, in writing a letter home, she complains, but then she comes to their point of view. Factory owners pay them $2 or $2.50 a week of wages, and in domestic service, they could not obtain much above 1/2 of this sum. She later writes, if you want to know the real aristocracy of this country, look at the factory girls. So she is seeing the results of young women making money and having financial agency, having a touch of independence, but also complaining that it's hard to get good help around here, and why can't she get her breakfast on time? So here's an illustration of that concept I mentioned, true womanhood. By 1855, right here, the young white Protestant women had left the mills for all sorts of reasons and were replaced with immigrant daughters, Greek, Irish, eventually French-Canadian. Middle-class moralists were indeed less concerned with those daughters, and the patronizing, paternalistic supervision of the workforce faded away. Here's a very popular image that was shown throughout the latter half of the 19th century, and it shows this idea of here's your success. Here's the well-filled table, a multi-generational table. Not only do you have children, but your children have children. And there's a woman teaching the next generation. There's her marriage. Notice how her head is bowed to the minister, to her husband, to God. She is submissive. She makes a pleasing home with music that would decontaminate the men in her family who worked. The outside world was seen as dog-eat-dog capitalism, and it was just an evil necessity of life. But the home, the woman would cleanse that and always give her husband the man cave that he deserved. So the Biddeford strike failed to restore wages or prevent the mills from controlling where girls lived. But it was a success if we take a longer view. The first lesson for both the young women and the mill owners was the power of collective action. The strikers brought the factory to a halt at the cost of considerable money each day. Time is money, and money is power. In organizing meetings, women practiced crafting an agenda, honing an argument, advancing a demand. They learned the power of numbers and that their individual experience was mirrored in other women. 150 years later, feminists would say the personal is political. And it's important to recognize these women's willingness to voice concerns in a public forum. Marching on public display, holding a public meeting, speaking out in public when the cultural norm was for women to be dutiful, submissive, at home, and quiet. And here's the upshot of earning cash wages in general. Women realized their economic worth and how their labor translated into success, happiness, or survival in their own lives. They also learned that they're not alone in their experiences, and they come to understand gender, that how they are women determine just about every facet of their lives. And not every woman liked that. Their normative future was tied to the financial, legal, and social protection of men. Earning one's own wages breaks the norm. And for some, it's liberating. For others, especially those worried about noisy women in the streets, it's terrifying. It's not long after the turnout that women gather in Seneca Falls, New York for the first Women's Rights Convention, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton helps write the Declaration of Sentiments. This key document in women's history makes these very points about gendered lives. And pragmatically, the Declaration of Sentiments includes demands for such things as women's keeping one's own wages, having the opportunity to pursue higher education, for the opening of the most lucrative and prestigious professions to women, including lawyer, doctor, ministry, college professors, being able to divorce, being able to keep any personal property you brought into marriage, abolishing the sexual double standard that permitted men to sow wild oats but would doom a woman for all eternity. And most controversial, but most important, the right to vote, suffrage. And 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, women would finally succeed. Ultimately, the great turnout was not an isolated incident. Strikes and agitation continued in Maine and beyond, demanding fair wages, safe conditions, and equal pay, among other concerns throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and 21st as well. The mill girls here in Biddeford are thus part of a chain of women across the centuries, finding how to use their voices to articulate their demands and to play a direct role in shaping their own lives. Those invested in maintaining a gendered status quo saw striking women as a source of mayhem and dead mill girls as emblematic of the danger women faced when they moved beyond their sphere. Mayhem and murder were emblematic of a society upside down. Yet these women, in experiencing a modicum of financial independence, in enjoying geographic mobility, in exploring a newfound sisterhood with like-minded women, were taking those first steps into enjoying the freedoms their brothers enjoyed as a matter of course. March 31st, 1776, almost 250 years, Abigail Adams writes to her husband, John, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Abigail Adams, 1776. From Abigail Adams during the American Revolution to the Women's March of January 2017 and several subsequent ones, when the mill girls of Biddeford turned out and marched down Main Street, they were marching for agency and self-determination in their own lives and ultimately in ours. Yes, that is after this period. Yes. The Bread and Roses strike, yes, this did. So what it illustrates is there's a long history of strikes. So we know mostly about that big Bread and Roses strike and the 10-hour workday strikes, including, again, strikes right here in Biddeford. The small, relatively smaller strikes, especially in this early period that didn't really garner any sort of measurable successes, we've forgotten in history. So here's a way, when we look back in history, that we can recover those early women who have really, when you think about it, kind of practiced the steps. So when we get to that big Lowell strike, you know, this is kind of a tried and true cultural script. So that's a great point to illustrate that oftentimes our view of history gets narrowed down to just this event and this event and this event. You know, we could think about any event. In women's history, we could think about any event, any war. Think of any war. Gettysburg comes to mind, or you know, the Battle of the Bulge, and another. But what about all the other days when there was fighting and hardship going on? In some ways, you know, recovering these lesser known stories helps us fill in the gaps, but it helps inform us how did those strikers in that massive bread and roses strike, how did they know what to do? How did they know how to act? How did they know how to hold a strike? Well, the answer is there was a good 60 years ahead of them that trained them to do that. One, you're absolutely right about the subsequent waves, different ethnic groups coming into the mills, and here's the reason why. One reason why we see the shift from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant New England girls out of the mills is because they started to use things like the strikes and the Lowell offering as a way to start really pushing their points of view and their agenda, and the mill owners didn't like that. And they also realized they had for the most part, a literate, educated for the day population of girls who had parents right around the corner who were going to take umbrage with the mill owners for any untoward action. So there was a lot of push to get them out of the mills. So think of the mills here. We moved the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant girls out, and then income, and I saw this in Mary Bean, we're just starting to see the beginning of the Irish workers. The Irish come in, will eventually have a big Greek population here, Franco-Americans, and initially they don't speak the same language. It's hard to organize if you don't speak the same language. So that's an interesting dynamic where we see protests, and then they dive, and then they come roaring back. It's one thing that was worrying, especially by the time we get to the 1840s, 1850s, middle-class society is looking around and realizing, awful lot of our daughters are in fact not coming back to their small villages. They're not marrying the boy next door. They're staying in these factory towns. They're marrying later. They're having children later. They're having fewer children, and some of them are quite entrepreneurial and open businesses for themselves, like sewing shops and hat shops and other appropriate female sorts of occupations. And some even start to think about higher education. And so in 1848, we see one of the very first colleges to admit women, and that is Oberlin. For the UNE crowd in the room, of course, we will mention that at the time called Westbrook Seminary, later Westbrook College, now the University of New England, were educating women since 1837. So very proud of that legacy. There is a definite shift. Middle class people and working class are recognizing this, and this is part of this push of, I don't think we want our girls here because they're not coming home. They're leading a little more independent lives, and people weren't so sure they liked that. Absolutely fascinating period. When I started this project on the death of the woman who was known as Mary Bean, her real name was Beringia Caswell, I thought this would be a very straightforward project. Girl goes to the mills, girl meets a guy, they do what young people do, she gets pregnant, and she ends up dying as a result. But once I started looking into this, she died in 1849, body was found in 1850. This is right at this moment where this is the richest moment in Biddeford history, right? Modern times of progress. That editor thought that Biddeford was just going to keep going, up, 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 up. This is a change in medical practice. The AMA is founded right around this time, 47, 48, somewhere right around there. And the first cause they take on is getting rid of the midwives, and getting rid of the homeopaths and the botanic physicians, and criminalizing abortion. So Mary Bean's death is much more than the story of the girl who, in the day, ministers would have said took a fatal step, went the wrong way, blah, 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 and died. This opens up a whole cultural moment in Saco and Biddeford. It was stunning to see this project just kind of unfold like layers in it. I think it's a specific event. I think it's that wage cut that was never made whole. That's what I think stimulated this. But I can't help but think that the ringleaders were thinking more broadly. And I think certainly people in Lowell and Lawrence were too. When does it go from being reactionary to being, and I hate this word, proactive? This is why we study these things from multiple angles, because everyone can, we all have a different lens to see it through. And that's how we get a full picture of history, a picture of the millwork here that is more inclusive, more diverse. When we start asking different questions, then we can, kind of retrace our steps and say, where could I look for those answers? So now you have geographic mobility and you have a marketable skill. And that's huge. That's huge. And we see that with Beringira. We see that she works first in Lowell and then in Manchester. And that's where she meets William Long, who is a young man from Biddeford, meets him in Manchester. They engage in what are called criminal relations. And then William was somewhat of a troublemaker, was fired from his job in Manchester, comes back to Biddeford. So by November, Beringira realizes things aren't quite right, and she goes to find William here. So yada, 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 she ends up dead. There's a murder trial. And during the murder, when she's first found, so her body is found in a culvert that was, a stream that used to run under Storer Street. The culvert was right about where the Saco police station is today, really ironically. So her body is found, and the newspapers are filled with this poor girl, this friendless victim, a cruel seducer, a lot of sympathy for her. Saco residents take up a collection to buy her a coffin and send her back home. That's in April of 1850 when her body is found. By winter of 51, when the murder trial, Dr. James Smith, is put on trial, she died consequence of abortion, septicemia. He was tried for murder. Very complicated loopholes and crosses in the law that made him initially tried for murder. But they get people on the stand, and people saying, yeah, well, she worked in Lowell, and then she worked in Manchester, and then she worked in Salem, Massachusetts. As if it's like, oh, she traveled around a lot. And a very interesting moment in court, Beringira's traveling trunk was found in Dr. James Smith's house. And so her sister Thais was in the court, and her role was to identify, to confirm that the dresses had belonged to her sister. And initially, the newspaper reporters are writing a plaid dress, a brown dress, a green dress with red dots, another dress, yet another dress. And it's clear that what they are saying is, she owns an awful lot of dresses. What decent woman needs all these dresses? And let alone one reason why a young girl on Storer Street could identify that Mary Bean and Beringira Caswell were one and the same, was that Beringira had the racy audacity to wear drop earrings. Oh. And again, why did she need to wear drop earrings? And that calling card, there was a calling card in there with a man's name. No one knew who he was. So what started out as sympathy, by the end of the trial, it's very gray. Yet Smith is sent off to jail. He's sent up to Thomaston. Later, the charges are downgraded from murder to manslaughter. He gets out after about 2 years, comes back to Saco, dies from tuberculosis. Is it his fault? He performed what in 1849 was a legal procedure. Legal procedure. What about William Long? He was certainly involved. Then again, Beringer stayed with Smith for about a month, and every Sunday, his only day off, William would go to that house and visit her. And on the fourth Sunday, knocks on the door, and Smith says, sorry, Mary Bean, that's the name he called her, Mary Bean died. Yeah, yellow fever. And William Long says, well, I should probably do something about the body. No, all taken care of. No, we're good. So is it his fault? Or is it Beringer's? So the trial ends very gray. And that's when you get this fiction that takes these characters and morphs them into a kind of a composite character named George Hamilton, all evil, evil man, just is going to seduce Mary Bean because he can. And then Mary Bean, who's beautiful and a little bit vain. And as soon as she is, petted, oh, you're so lovely. Of course I'll marry you. She falls for it. Bum, bum, bum. She dies in the fiction too. Spoiler. So you get this incident that reveals so much about this particular moment in time. And this is all set in this background of the results of the Industrial Revolution. Bum, bum, bum. I see snacks. I speak for cheese. If anyone's interested, I do have copies of The Murder of Mary Bean. The first half of the book is the real story of Beringer and Caswell. Second half of the book are the two fictional pieces of sensational fiction about the Mary Bean murder. And then this is my recent book, Come Ask Me About It. This is about Maine's, as far as I know, Maine's first undercover detective. She spied, I know this is going to shock you, for a U.S. congressman who wanted her to spy on his mistress. Shocking, I know, can you believe it? A congressman of all people. So, thank you very much for your attention and your very good questions.